6 years ago, 15-year-old Chloe vanished into the Virginia woods with her beloved horse, Orion. The search turned up nothing. The case went cold. Her mother Helena never stopped believing she was alive. Now, at an elite equestrian competition, Helena sees the impossible, a horse identical to Orion, owned by a wealthy philanthropist. But when she looks into the man's wife's terrified eyes, Helena realizes this isn't coincidence. It's the key to a nightmare that's about to unravel a carefully hidden truth. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The morning mist clung to the weathered fence posts of Wildwood stables like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the past. Helena Caldwell stood at the kitchen window of the old farmhouse, her calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had long since lost its warmth. The coffee inside had grown cold and bitter, much like the taste that had settled permanently in her mouth since that October day 6 years ago, when her world had shattered into irreparable pieces. The silence of dawn was broken only by the distant whinnying of horses in the pasture, their voices carrying across the dew-soaked fields like echoes from a happier time. Helena's eyes traced the familiar landscape that stretched before her, taking in every crack in the barn's red paint, every loose board that she could no longer afford to repair, every weed that had claimed victory over her once pristine flower beds. This land had been in the Caldwell family for 3 generations, passed down from grandfather to father to daughter, each custodian adding their own dreams and sweat to its legacy. Now it felt more like a monument to failure than a home. The foreclosure notice still lay crumpled on the kitchen table, its harsh legal language a stark reminder of her rapidly dwindling options. Bank statements scattered around it painted an even grimmer picture, each red number another nail in the coffin of her family's heritage. Helena had read every line countless times, searching for some miracle clause that might save her. But the mathematics of loss were unforgiving and absolute. Her reflection in the window showed a woman aged beyond her 42 years. Once vibrant auburn hair now hung in limp strands, streaked with premature gray that caught the morning light like silver threads of sorrow. Her green eyes, which Chloe had inherited, were rimmed with dark circles that spoke of countless sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that final day. The laugh lines that had once defined her face had been replaced by deeper grooves of worry and grief, etched permanently into her features like a map of heartbreak. In the distance, Chance grazed peacefully in the morning light, his chestnut coat gleaming with health despite the decline that surrounded him. He was her last hope, the final card she had to play in this desperate game of survival. The stallion possessed a rare combination of speed, grace, and intelligence that had caught the attention of several prominent figures in the equestrian world. Tomorrow's competition in Virginia represented more than just a horse show. It was her final opportunity to secure the kind of sponsorship deal that might save Wildwood stables from extinction. Helena's fingers traced the condensation on the window as her mind wandered back to that morning 6 years ago. Chloe had been 15, her face radiant with the kind of joy that only comes from pure, unbridled passion. She had burst through these same kitchen doors, her riding boots clattering against the worn wooden floors, her dark hair still tousled from sleep. The memory played in Helena's mind with crystal clarity. Chloe's excited chatter about taking Orion on a trail ride through the dense woods that bordered their property, her promises to be back before dinner, the way she had paused at the door to flash that brilliant smile that could light up the darkest room. That smile haunted Helena's dreams and waking hours alike. It was the last image she had of her daughter, frozen in time like a photograph that would never fade. The search parties had combed through hundreds of acres of Virginia woodland, their flashlights cutting through the gathering dusk like fallen stars. Volunteers had called Chloe's name until their voices were raw, the sound echoing through ancient trees that stood as silent witnesses to whatever tragedy had unfolded beneath their canopy. The official investigation had concluded that Chloe and Orion had likely suffered some kind of accident in the treacherous terrain. The dense forest was known for its hidden ravines and unstable ground, places where a horse and rider could disappear without a trace. Authorities had suggested that both had probably fallen into one of the many deep gorges that scarred the landscape, their bodies claimed by the wilderness. But Helena had never accepted this explanation. A mother's intuition, that indefinable connection between parent and child, insisted that something else had happened. The lack of any physical evidence, any sign of struggle or accident, gnawed at her like a persistent wound that refused to heal. The preparation for tomorrow's journey began with mechanical precision born from years of routine. Helena moved through the barn with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic despite the weight of exhaustion that pressed down on her shoulders. She cleaned Chance's stall with meticulous care, replacing old straw with fresh bedding, ensuring every detail met her exacting standards. The familiar ritual provided a measure of comfort, a temporary respite from the chaos that had consumed her life. Chance seemed to sense the significance of the coming day. The stallion's ears pricked forward attentively as Helena brushed his coat, his intelligent brown eyes following her every movement. She worked in steady strokes, the rhythmic motion of the brush creating patterns in his chestnut fur that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the barn windows. Each stroke was deliberate, almost meditative, a connection between woman and horse that transcended words. This animal represented her final throw of the dice, the last chance to save everything she and her family had built over decades of dedication and sacrifice. The horse trailer sat in the driveway like a metal coffin, its silver sides reflecting the pale morning sun. Helena had spent the previous evening inspecting every inch of it, checking tire pressure, testing the hitch, ensuring that nothing could go wrong during the crucial journey ahead. The vehicle had seen better days, its once pristine exterior now bearing the scars of countless trips to competitions across the state. But it was mechanically sound, and that was all that mattered now. As she loaded hay bales and feed bags into the trailer, Helena's movements were deliberate and careful. Every item had its place, every necessity accounted for. She double-checked water containers, examined lead ropes for signs of wear, and ensured that Chance's travel blanket was clean and properly fitted. These details mattered. In the high-stakes world of equestrian competition, presentation was everything, and she could not afford a single mistake that might cost her this opportunity. The paperwork lay spread across the kitchen table when she returned to the house. Registration forms, health certificates, insurance documents, and the competition entry that had cost her the last of her savings account. Each signature she had placed on these forms felt like signing away another piece of her soul. But desperation had long since overridden pride. The entry fee alone could have paid for a month of feed. But without this chance to showcase Chance's abilities to potential sponsors, there would be no future months to worry about. Helena's suitcase sat open on her bed, half-packed with the simple, practical clothes that comprised her wardrobe these days. Gone were the designer riding jackets and custom boots that had once been her trademark at competitions. Financial necessity had stripped away such luxuries, leaving behind only the essentials. She folded each item with care, her movements slow and deliberate, as if postponing the act of closing the suitcase might somehow delay the reality of what lay ahead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property as Helena made her final preparations. She walked the fence line one last time, checking for any damage that might allow the remaining horses to escape during her absence. Her boots crunched on autumn leaves that had begun their annual migration from tree to earth, creating a carpet of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now, even nature's artistry seemed muted by the overwhelming weight of her circumstances. In the barn office, a small, cluttered space that had once been the nerve center of a thriving operation, Helena pulled out a worn photo album. Its pages were filled with images from happier times. Chloe's first riding lesson at age 6, her first blue ribbon at 8, the day she had bonded with Orion as a gangly 12-year-old. Each photograph told a story of growth, achievement, and pure joy that felt impossibly distant now. Helena's fingers lingered on a particular image of Chloe and Orion jumping a practice fence, both horse and rider captured in a moment of perfect harmony and trust. Orion had been magnificent, a black stallion with a distinctive white star on his forehead that made him instantly recognizable. His intelligence had been remarkable, his loyalty to Chloe absolute. The bond between the 15-year-old girl and her horse had been something magical to witness, a partnership that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and animal. They had moved as one entity, sharing thoughts and intentions in a way that had amazed even experienced horsemen. The memories threatened to overwhelm her, as they always did, but Helena forced herself to close the album and focus on the present. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or final defeat, and she needed to be prepared for both possibilities. The sponsors she hoped to attract were sophisticated, demanding individuals who would judge not just Chance's performance, but her own credibility as a trainer and stable owner. She could not afford to appear desperate, even though desperation was the only thing keeping her upright. As evening approached, Helena completed her final checks of the trailer and equipment. The loading ramp was tested and retested, the internal padding examined for any sharp edges that might injure Chance during transport. She had made this journey countless times over the years, but never with so much riding on the outcome. The weight of 3 generations of family history pressed down on her shoulders as she secured the last of the equipment and prepared for what might be her final attempt to save Wildwood Stables. The house felt emptier than usual as Helena moved through its familiar rooms one last time before tomorrow's early departure. In Chloe's room, which she had left exactly as it was 6 years ago, riding trophies still gleamed on their shelves, their brass plates catching the last rays of sunlight. Posters of famous horses and riders decorated the walls, while a collection of model horses occupied a special shelf near the window. This shrine to her missing daughter had become both a source of comfort and a monument to her inability to accept what everyone else believed to be true. The Virginia competition represented more than just a business opportunity. It was a pilgrimage back to the state where Chloe had vanished, where the mystery of her disappearance had begun and might someday find its resolution. Helena had chosen this particular event not just for its prestige but for its location, driven by an irrational hope that returning to Virginia might somehow bring her closer to the truth she had been seeking for 6 long years. The Virginia Equestrian Center sprawled across manicured grounds like a testament to wealth and privilege, its pristine white fences gleaming under the autumn sun. Helena's weathered trailer looked conspicuously out of place among the fleet of luxury horse transporters that lined the competitors' area, their polished chrome and custom paint jobs reflecting a world she had once belonged to but could no longer afford to inhabit. The contrast was stark and humbling, a visual reminder of how far she had fallen from her former status in the equestrian community. The morning air carried the familiar symphony of pre-competition activity, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on concrete, the soft whickers of horses greeting each other, the crisp commands of trainers preparing their charges for the day's events. Mixed with these sounds was the more refined chatter of spectators and sponsors, their voices carrying the casual confidence that came with substantial bank accounts and social connections. Helena moved through this world like a ghost returning to haunt familiar territory, recognized by some but welcomed by few. Her hands trembled slightly as she unloaded Chance from the trailer, the stallion's nostrils flaring as he took in the new environment. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, processing the overwhelming sensory input of hundreds of horses, thousands of people, and the electric tension that always preceded major competitions. Helena's own nervous energy seemed to transfer to Chance through the lead rope, creating a feedback loop of anxiety that she struggled to control. Every detail mattered today. Every impression could determine whether Wildwood Stables lived or died. The warm-up arena buzzed with controlled chaos as riders put their mounts through their paces, each partnership seeking that perfect harmony between human intention and equine response. Helena watched the other competitors with a mixture of admiration and envy, noting the quality of their equipment, the precision of their movements, the easy confidence that came from financial security. These were people who rode for glory rather than survival, their participation in the sport a celebration rather than a desperate gamble. As she guided Chance through his preliminary exercises, Helena's attention was fragmented. Part of her mind focused on her horse's performance, while another part scanned the crowd for potential sponsors. She recognized several faces from her previous life in competitive riding, people who had once considered her an equal, but now viewed her with the uncomfortable pity reserved for the formerly successful. Their polite nods and forced smiles carried an unmistakable message. She no longer belonged in their world. The main arena stood like a coliseum of privilege, its sand footing raked to perfection, and its jumps arranged in artistic configurations that challenged both horse and rider. Spectators filled the grandstands in carefully orchestrated layers of social hierarchy, with the most influential patrons occupying prime seating, while lesser mortals arranged themselves according to their perceived importance in the equestrian ecosystem. Helena studied these potential sponsors with the intensity of a predator analyzing prey, memorizing faces and calculating approaches for after her performance. It was during this reconnaissance that her world tilted on its axis. Among the collection of elite horses being prepared for competition, one animal stood out with such shocking familiarity that Helena's breath caught in her throat. The stallion was magnificent, his coat a deep, lustrous black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the distinctive white star centered perfectly on his forehead that caused Helena's heart to stop, her vision to tunnel, and her legs to weaken beneath her. The marking was identical, absolutely identical, to the one that had adorned Orion's noble head. The shape was precise, a five-pointed star with slightly irregular edges that Helena had traced with her fingers countless times during grooming sessions. But this was impossible. Orion was dead. Had been dead for 6 years. His body claimed by the Virginia wilderness along with her daughter. Yet here stood a horse that could have been his twin, displaying the same proud carriage, the same intelligent alertness, the same distinctive marking that had made Orion instantly recognizable. Helena's hands began to shake uncontrollably as she moved closer, chance forgotten behind her as she was drawn by a force beyond rational explanation. The black stallion's head turned toward her approach, and his dark eyes seemed to hold a flicker of recognition that sent ice water through her veins. Those eyes, deep brown and infinitely expressive, carried the same gentle intelligence that had made Orion such a remarkable horse. The angle of his ears, the arch of his neck, the way he held his weight distributed evenly across all 4 hooves, every detail screamed familiarity to a woman who had spent years studying equine behavior and anatomy. The horse's nameplate read Eclipse in elegant brass lettering, but Helena barely registered the name as she circled the animal with increasing urgency. His conformation was perfect, his muscle definition suggesting years of careful conditioning and expert care. But it was the intangible qualities that disturbed her most. The way he moved with fluid grace, the alertness in his posture that suggested a horse accustomed to being the center of attention, the subtle confidence that marked a truly exceptional animal. A small crowd had gathered around Eclipse, their voices carrying the reverent tones reserved for discussing truly valuable horseflesh. Helena caught fragments of their conversation. Championship bloodlines, 6-figure purchase price, undefeated competition record. But these details faded into background noise as she continued her examination, searching for some flaw in the resemblance that would restore her sanity and allow her to dismiss this as mere coincidence. Warren Hayes materialized beside his prize stallion like a man accustomed to being the center of attention. He was impeccably dressed in custom riding attire that probably cost more than Helena's monthly mortgage payment, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and professional. Everything about him projected success and authority, from his confident posture to the expensive watch that caught the light as he gestured toward his horse. He spoke with the easy charm of someone who had never questioned his place in the world, his words flowing with the smooth cadence of practiced public speaking. Helena found herself studying Warren with the same intensity she had devoted to his horse, searching for some crack in his polished facade that might explain the terrible coincidence that had brought them together. His features were conventionally handsome in the way that money and good breeding could enhance natural attributes, but his eyes held a coolness that seemed at odds with his warm public persona. There was something calculating in his gaze, a quality that made Helena's skin crawl, even as she struggled to understand why. The support team that surrounded Warren and Eclipse moved with military precision, each member fulfilling their assigned role in the complex choreography of elite competition. They wore matching uniforms bearing Warren's corporate logo, their equipment was state-of-the-art, and their demeanor suggested they were accustomed to working with unlimited resources. When Helena attempted to move closer to Eclipse, these staff members smoothly intercepted her approach with polite but firm redirection. Their actions coordinated in a way that suggested prior training in crowd control. The woman who stood slightly apart from Warren's entourage commanded Helena's attention, with her stark contrast to the surrounding luxury. Penelope Hayes possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed dimmed by an internal shadow, her elegant features marred by an expression of profound sadness that no amount of expensive cosmetics could conceal. She was dressed in designer clothing that hung on her slender frame like beautiful armor, but her posture suggested a woman trying to make herself invisible despite her prominent position as Warren's wife. Penelope's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she watched the proceedings, her fingers worrying at the expensive rings that adorned them like talismans against some unnamed fear. Her skin had the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors, and dark circles under her expertly made-up eyes suggested chronic insomnia or persistent anxiety. Everything about her bearing indicated a woman under tremendous psychological pressure, a bird trapped in a gilded cage who had forgotten how to sing. When their eyes met across the crowd, Helena felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with physical familiarity. Penelope's gaze held a quality of desperate communication, a silent scream for help that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to Helena's maternal instincts. For a brief, electric moment, the two women shared a connection that transcended their vastly different circumstances, an understanding that passed between them like a current of shared pain. The moment lasted only seconds before Penelope's eyes darted away, her attention returning to the ground as if she had revealed too much of her inner turmoil to a stranger. But Helena had seen enough in that brief exchange to recognize a fellow sufferer, someone whose polished exterior concealed wounds that might never heal. The recognition sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air, and everything to do with a growing certainty that this encounter was no accident. Warren's staff continued their efforts to manage Helena's proximity to their prized stallion, their methods polite, but increasingly insistent as she lingered near Eclipse despite their subtle suggestions that she move along. Their professional smiles never wavered, but Helena could sense their growing discomfort with her intense scrutiny of the horse. She found herself cataloging their reactions, noting which staff members seemed merely protective of valuable property, and which ones appeared genuinely nervous about her presence. The black stallion himself seemed oblivious to the human drama unfolding around him, his attention focused on the familiar pre-competition routine that had become his life. He stood with the patience of a seasoned performer, accepting the ministrations of his handlers with the dignity of an animal accustomed to being the center of attention. Yet Helena continued to detect something in his bearing that suggested depths beyond mere training, an intelligence and awareness that reminded her so strongly of Orion that her chest ached with renewed grief. The crowd around Eclipse began to disperse as competition schedules demanded attention elsewhere, but Helena remained frozen in place, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. The logical part of her brain insisted that resemblances between horses were not uncommon, that her grief-stricken imagination was creating connections where none existed. But every instinct she possessed screamed that something was profoundly wrong with this situation, that the appearance of Eclipse was not the innocent coincidence it appeared to be. As the morning progressed and competition events began in earnest, Helena found herself unable to focus on her own preparation or the potential sponsors she had come to court. Her attention remained fixated on Warren Hayes and his remarkable horse, her mind spinning theories and possibilities that grew more fantastic with each passing minute. The weight of 6 years of unanswered questions pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, and the sight of Eclipse had torn open wounds she had thought were finally beginning to heal. The arena announcements echoed across the grounds, calling competitors to their various events, but Helena heard them as if from a great distance. Her world had narrowed to encompass only the terrible possibility that had taken root in her mind, a suspicion so outrageous that she barely dared acknowledge it even to herself. Yet as she watched Warren Hayes bask in the admiration of his peers, his beautiful wife standing silent and trapped beside him, Helena felt the first stirrings of something she had not experienced in years, hope mixed with a determination that burned like fire in her chest. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Virginia Equestrian Center as Helena found herself consumed by an obsession that had nothing to do with her original purpose for attending the competition. Her performance with Chance had been adequate but unremarkable, her mind too fractured by the sight of Eclipse to focus properly on the intricate choreography required for elite show jumping. The potential sponsors she had hoped to impress had moved on to more compelling presentations, leaving her standing alone beside the warm-up ring with the bitter taste of missed opportunity coating her tongue like ash. But material concerns had become secondary to the burning need that now drove her every action. The image of Eclipse haunted her thoughts with relentless intensity, each detail of his appearance replaying in her mind's eye with photographic clarity. The precise shape of his white star, the intelligent expression in his dark eyes, the graceful way he carried himself through space, every element combined to create a portrait so identical to her lost Orion that coincidence seemed impossible. Yet the alternative explanation her mind was constructing seemed even more impossible, too fantastic and horrible to acknowledge even in the privacy of her own thoughts. Helena's hands shook as she removed Chance's competition tack, her movements mechanical and distracted while her attention remained focused on the distant area where Warren Hayes had established his operation. From her vantage point, she could observe the comings and goings of his extensive entourage, noting the military precision with which they managed every aspect of Eclipse's care and presentation. The level of security and organization around a single horse struck her as excessive, even for an animal of obvious value in breeding. Penelope Hayes had become the focal point of Helena's surveillance, her delicate figure moving through the crowd like a wraith in expensive clothing. The woman's every gesture spoke of careful self-control, her posture rigidly perfect despite the obvious emotional turmoil that Helena had glimpsed in their brief encounter. She held herself with the brittle elegance of fine porcelain, beautiful but fragile, always on the verge of shattering under pressures that remained invisible to casual observers. The opportunity Helena had been unconsciously waiting for presented itself as the afternoon competition events drew the majority of spectators toward the main arena. Penelope had separated herself from Warren's group, walking with apparent aimlessness toward a quieter section of the grounds where vendor booths offered respite from the intensity of active competition. Her movements were slow and deliberate, those of someone seeking solitude rather than company, her designer heels clicking against concrete walkways with metronomic precision that spoke of years of training and proper deportment. Helena followed at a distance that she hoped appeared casual, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared for a confrontation that could either provide answers or confirm her descent into paranoid delusion. The warm autumn air felt thick and oppressive as she navigated through clusters of equipment trailers and temporary stabling, her breathing shallow and rapid with the kind of anxiety that preceded life-altering moments. Every step brought her closer to a conversation that might finally provide the key to 6 years of unanswered questions. The area where Penelope had sought refuge was a small garden space designed to provide aesthetic relief from the utilitarian competition grounds. Ornamental shrubs had been arranged around a modest seating area, their autumn foliage creating a natural screen that offered privacy from the constant scrutiny of the equestrian community. A small fountain provided white noise that would mask the sound of quiet conversation, its gentle burbling a soothing counterpoint to the distant sounds of horses and their handlers. Penelope sat on a wrought iron bench with her hands folded in her lap, her posture suggesting meditation or prayer rather than simple rest. Up close, the evidence of her distress was even more apparent. The slight tremor in her carefully manicured fingers, the way her eyes darted constantly toward the paths that might bring unwanted observers. The tension in her shoulders that spoke of muscles held rigid for so long that relaxation had become impossible. She was a woman living in a state of constant vigilance, always alert for threats that might materialize from any direction. When Helena approached, Penelope's reaction was immediate and telling. Her entire body stiffened as if she had been struck by an electric current, her hands gripping the edge of the bench with such force that her knuckles went white beneath the thin skin. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, the response of someone accustomed to being startled by unexpected encounters. For a moment, Helena thought the woman might flee, her muscles coiling with the potential energy of flight. But something in Helena's own appearance seemed to register with Penelope. Perhaps the raw desperation that 6 years of grief had etched into every line of her face. The two women regarded each other in silence, each recognizing in the other a fellow traveler through landscapes of pain that could not be adequately mapped or described to those who had never visited such territories. The connection was immediate and profound, transcending the vast differences in their circumstances and social positions. Helena's approach was careful and non-threatening, her movements slow and deliberate, as she positioned herself within conversational distance without invading Penelope's personal space. She could see the war being fought behind the other woman's carefully composed features, the battle between ingrained caution and a desperate need for human connection. Years of isolation and fear had taught Penelope to trust no one, but Helena's obvious anguish seemed to penetrate defenses that had been constructed against more conventional threats. The story of Chloe and Orion poured from Helena's lips, with the desperate urgency of water escaping through a broken dam. She spoke of her daughter's passion for riding, her exceptional talent that had promised a brilliant future, the unbreakable bond between girl and horse that had defined both their lives. The words came in a torrent of emotion that had been dammed up for too long, carrying with them the weight of 6 years of suppressed grief and unanswered questions. As Helena spoke, she watched Penelope's carefully maintained composure begin to crack like ice subjected to sudden temperature change. Tears formed in the corners of the woman's eyes, threatening to spill over and ruin the expensive makeup that served as both enhancement and camouflage. Her breathing became more labored, and she pressed a trembling hand to her chest, as if trying to contain emotions that had grown too large for the space available to them. The mention of Orion's distinctive markings brought a visible flinch from Penelope, a reaction so sharp and immediate that it confirmed Helena's growing suspicions. The white star, the black coat, the particular grace with which the horse moved. These details struck Penelope like physical blows, each one adding to the weight of knowledge that she carried like stones in her chest. Her internal struggle was visible in the play of emotions across her features. Fear and guilt and desperate longing all competing for dominance. When Helena described the morning of Chloe's disappearance, the last conversation between mother and daughter, the search efforts that had consumed months of her life, Penelope's composure finally shattered completely. Silent tears began to flow down her cheeks, carving channels through carefully applied foundation and leaving tracks of raw honesty on a face that had been trained to reveal nothing of its owner's inner life. Her shoulders began to shake with suppressed sobs, the physical manifestation of grief that had been held prisoner for too long. The transformation was complete when Penelope finally lifted her head to meet Helena's eyes directly, the careful mask of aristocratic indifference replaced by naked human emotion. In that moment, she was no longer Warren Hayes's elegant trophy wife, but simply a woman drowning in secrets that had poisoned every aspect of her existence. The recognition that passed between them was instantaneous and complete. The acknowledgement of shared suffering that created an immediate bond stronger than social convention or personal safety. Penelope's internal struggle was visible in every micro-expression that flickered across her features. Helena could see the war being fought between self-preservation and human decency, between the habits of fear that had kept her alive and safe and the moral imperative to help another suffering human being. Her hands moved restlessly in her lap, twisting and untwisting, reaching toward something and then pulling back as if the very air around them had become dangerous to touch. The decisive moment came with a gesture so small and quick that Helena almost missed it entirely. Penelope's hand disappeared briefly into the small designer purse that sat beside her on the bench, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a familiar action under stress. When her hand emerged, it held something small and metallic that caught the filtered sunlight like a captured star. The transfer happened in the space between heartbeats, Penelope's trembling fingers pressing the object into Helena's palm with desperate urgency. The metal was warm from contact with human skin, and Helena's fingers closed around it instinctively, even as her mind struggled to process what had just occurred. The weight of the object was negligible, but its significance felt enormous, a concentration of meaning that seemed to warp the space around them. Helena's breath caught in her throat as she opened her palm to reveal a small silver medallion, its surface polished to a mirror finish that reflected fragments of the world around them. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of work that spoke of significant expense and careful attention to detail. But it was the engraving on the front that caused Helena's vision to tunnel and her legs to weaken beneath her. The name Chloe was etched in elegant script across the medallion's surface, each letter formed with the precision that came from skilled craftsmanship and loving attention. The style was distinctive, a custom piece that Helena recognized with the absolute certainty that comes from intimate familiarity. This was the medallion she had given to her daughter on her 13th birthday, a piece of jewelry that had been specially commissioned from a local artisan who specialized in equestrian-themed accessories. The back of the medallion bore an image of a horse in mid-jump, its form captured in perfect detail despite the small canvas available to the engraver. Helena remembered the hours she had spent with the craftsman, describing exactly how she wanted Chloe's beloved sport represented in precious metal. The horse depicted was generic enough to represent the sport as a whole, but specific enough to capture the grace and power that made show jumping so compelling to both participants and observers. Helena's world tilted on its axis as the implications of holding this impossible object crashed over her in successive waves. This medallion had been around Chloe's neck the morning she disappeared, a birthday gift that had become her daughter's most treasured possession. Helena had mentioned it specifically to the police during their initial investigation, describing it as one of the few ways to identify Chloe if the worst had happened. The piece was unique, custom-made, irreplaceable. The mathematical probability of this medallion appearing in the possession of Warren Hayes's wife at the same event, where a horse identical to Orion was being displayed, struck Helena as so astronomically small that coincidence could be ruled out entirely. The connections forming in her mind were too numerous and specific to dismiss as paranoid imagination. Someone had taken these items from her daughter, and that someone was connected to the Hayes family in ways that Helena was only beginning to understand. Penelope's reaction to Helena's shock was immediate and telling. The woman's face had gone pale as winter moonlight, her breathing rapid and shallow, as if she were on the verge of hyperventilation. Her eyes darted constantly toward the paths that might bring observers, and her entire posture spoke of someone who had just committed an act of tremendous courage that might cost her everything. The medallion's transfer represented a line crossed, a point of no return in whatever dangerous game she had been forced to play. The weight of 6 years of grief and uncertainty condensed into the small piece of silver that lay warm in Helena's palm, its presence both validation and condemnation. Here was proof that Chloe had not simply vanished into the Virginia wilderness, that her disappearance was not the result of some tragic accident involving unstable terrain and hidden ravines. Someone had taken her daughter, and that someone had kept this medallion as either trophy or reminder of their crime. Helena's mind began to race through the implications with frightening speed, connecting dots that painted a picture too horrible to fully acknowledge. Warren Hayes, with his wealth and influence, his interest in equestrian sports, his possession of a horse identical to Orion, his wife's obvious distress, and the medallion she had just risked everything to pass along. The pattern suggested a truth so monstrous that Helena's rational mind recoiled from its implications, even as her maternal instincts screamed that she had finally found the key to her daughter's fate. The silver medallion burned against Helena's palm like a talisman of terrible purpose, as she sat in her truck outside the gates of Warren Hayes's estate, her heart hammering against her ribs with the irregular rhythm of desperation and determination. The property stretched before her like a fortress of wealth and privilege, its perimeter defined by wrought iron fencing that stood 12 feet high and was crowned with decorative spears that served both aesthetic and defensive purposes. Beyond the barrier, manicured lawns rolled away toward a mansion that belonged in architectural magazines, its Georgian revival columns and perfectly proportioned windows speaking of old money and established power. The security system was immediately apparent even to Helena's untrained eye. A sophisticated network of cameras mounted on discrete posts that provided overlapping coverage of every approach to the property. Motion sensors created invisible barriers that would alert monitors to any unauthorized presence, while the main gate featured both electronic locks and a guardhouse staffed by personnel whose bearings suggested military or police backgrounds. This was not the home of someone who trusted in the goodwill of his fellow citizens, but rather a stronghold designed to keep the outside world at bay. Helena had spent 3 sleepless hours conducting reconnaissance from various vantage points around the estate's perimeter, mapping the locations of cameras and sensors with the obsessive attention to detail that only a parent seeking their lost child could maintain. Her notebook filled with sketches and observations, each mark on paper representing another piece of the puzzle she was attempting to solve. The medallion never left her grip, its familiar weight serving as both motivation and reminder that her daughter had been here, was perhaps still here, somewhere beyond these intimidating defenses. The opportunity she had been praying for materialized near midnight when a service truck approached the rear gate, its driver apparently expected by the security staff. Helena watched through borrowed binoculars as the guards performed their routine check, noting the casual efficiency with which they processed the delivery. More importantly, she observed the brief window during which the service gate remained open while the truck navigated the narrow entrance, leaving just enough space for someone small and determined to slip through undetected. Her approach to the property line was a masterclass in controlled desperation, every movement calculated to avoid the sensors whose locations she had so carefully mapped. The autumn grass was wet with dew that soaked through her dark clothing, chilling her skin but providing natural camouflage against the estate's carefully maintained landscape. Helena moved like a shadow given substance, pausing frequently to listen for any sound that might indicate detection. Her breathing controlled, despite the adrenaline that flooded her system with each forward step. The moment of truth came as another service vehicle approached the gate, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. Helena sprinted across the 15 feet of open ground with a speed born of maternal desperation, her boots finding purchase on the damp grass despite the treacherous conditions. She rolled beneath the closing gate with seconds to spare, the metal barrier brushing against her back as it sealed the estate from the outside world and trapped her within whatever truth waited in the shadows ahead. The grounds beyond the fence were even more impressive than they had appeared from outside, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth that extended in every direction. Specimen trees had been positioned with artistic precision, their autumn foliage creating natural sculptures against the starlit sky. Water features provided gentle background noise that would mask the sound of footsteps, while garden lighting had been arranged to illuminate pathways while leaving convenient shadows for someone seeking to avoid detection. The main house loomed ahead like a monument to prosperity, its windows glowing with warm light that spoke of comfort and security. But Helena's attention was drawn inexorably toward the complex of outbuildings that lay beyond the mansion, structures whose purpose was immediately apparent to someone who had spent their life around horses. The stables represented a level of luxury that made even elite competition facilities seem modest by comparison, their architecture echoing the main house while being perfectly adapted to their equestrian purpose. As she moved through the carefully landscaped grounds, Helena found herself cataloging details that spoke to Warren Hayes's obsessive attention to perfection. Every element of the estate had been designed and maintained to exacting standards, from the precisely edged walkways to the specimen plantings that had obviously been selected for their year-round visual impact. This was the home of someone who demanded control over every aspect of his environment, who could not tolerate even the smallest deviation from his vision of how things should be. The stable complex revealed itself gradually as Helena approached, its true scale becoming apparent only when she was close enough to appreciate the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. The building materials were the finest available, timber that had been selected for both strength and beauty, hardware that gleamed despite the darkness, stonework that spoke of artisans who took pride in their craft. These stables had been built to house royalty, human or equine, with no expense spared in their creation. The security around the stables was lighter than around the main house, but still sophisticated enough to require careful navigation. Helena used her detailed observations from earlier reconnaissance to avoid the camera positions she had noted, moving between blind spots with the precision of someone whose child's life might depend on remaining undetected. The wet grass muffled her footsteps, and the carefully planned landscaping provided natural concealment from electronic eyes that never slept. Her first glimpse inside the main stable block took her breath away with its opulence and attention to detail. The central aisle was wide enough for a parade, its floor made of interlocked rubber pavers that would provide both comfort and traction for valuable horses. Brass fittings gleamed under subtle lighting that had been designed to be both functional and aesthetically pleasing, while the stall fronts were crafted from tropical hardwoods that probably cost more per square foot than most people's homes. But it was the horses themselves that commanded attention, their quality immediately apparent even to someone viewing them in dim lighting. These were animals that represented the pinnacle of selective breeding and expert care, their coats gleaming with health despite the late hour. Helena counted at least 20 stalls, each containing a horse that would have been the pride of any normal stable. Yet here they seemed like a collection assembled by someone with unlimited resources and exacting standards. The young man she encountered near the back of the stable moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to working around sleeping horses, his presence initially causing Helena's heart to leap with fear of discovery. But something in his posture, in the gentle way he handled the animals under his care, suggested a kindness that might be turned to her advantage. He was perhaps 25, with the lean build and calloused hands that spoke of someone who earned his living through physical labor, his worn work clothes a stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded them. Liam's reaction to Helena's sudden appearance was immediate wariness, followed quickly by concern as he took in her obvious distress. The story she told him in urgent whispers caused his expression to shift from suspicion to alarm, to something approaching understanding. He had been working on the Hayes estate for 3 years, he revealed in equally quiet tones, and had always sensed that something was not quite right about his employer's obsession with privacy and security. The restricted area Liam led her to lay beyond the main stables, accessed through a door marked with warnings about authorized personnel only. The building beyond was smaller than the main stable but constructed with the same attention to detail and quality of materials. However, its purpose seemed different, more personal, as if it had been designed to house something of particular importance to Warren Hayes, rather than being merely another display of his wealth and status. The interior of this private stable was arranged around a single, magnificent stall that occupied the central position like a shrine. The craftsmanship here exceeded even what Helena had observed in the main facility. with every detail executed to a standard that bordered on the obsessive. Custom metalwork created flowing patterns in the stall front, while the flooring appeared to be made of materials that would provide both comfort and easy maintenance for whatever precious occupant called this space home. The horse that inhabited this luxurious prison was magnificent beyond description, his black coat seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, his form displaying the perfect proportions that marked him as exceptional even among his elite peers. But it was the distinctive white star centered on his forehead that caused Helena's knees to buckle and her vision to tunnel with recognition. This was Orion, her daughter's beloved companion, older now, but unmistakably the same animal who had vanished 6 years ago, along with the girl who loved him. The young woman who emerged from the shadows moved with a grace that spoke of years spent in the company of horses, her bare feet making no sound on the rubber flooring as she approached the magnificent stallion. She was perhaps 21, her hair long and dark, her build suggesting someone who had spent considerable time engaged in physical activity. But it was her face that caused Helena's world to shift on its axis, the features that had matured and refined but remained unmistakably familiar despite the passage of years. The recognition was instantaneous and complete, bypassing rational thought and striking directly at the maternal bond that no amount of time or distance could diminish. This was Chloe, her lost daughter, alive and apparently well, but living in circumstances that raised more questions than they answered. The girl's clothing was simple but well made, her overall appearance suggesting someone who was cared for, but perhaps not entirely free to make her own choices about her circumstances. The tender way the young woman interacted with Orion spoke of a relationship that had survived whatever trauma had brought them to this place. Her hands moved over the stallion's neck and face with the familiarity that comes from years of intimate companionship, while his response to her touch demonstrated a bond that had only deepened with time. They were partners in whatever strange captivity they shared, finding comfort in each other's presence despite the artificial paradise that surrounded them. Helena's emotional response to seeing her daughter alive was overwhelming in its intensity, a combination of joy, relief, rage, and protective fury that threatened to consume her entirely. 6 years of grief and self-recrimination evaporated in an instant, replaced by a maternal love so fierce it felt like a physical force. Every instinct screamed at her to rush forward, to embrace this miracle, to reclaim what had been stolen from her so long ago. But the setting and circumstances demanded caution. This was clearly a delicate situation that required careful handling, if it was to result in Chloe's safe return rather than further tragedy. Helena forced herself to remain still, to observe and assess before taking action that might jeopardize the reunion she had dreamed of for 6 long years. The young woman who had been her 15-year-old daughter was now an adult, changed by whatever experiences had shaped her during her captivity. Chloe's movements around the stable were those of someone following a familiar routine, her actions suggesting that caring for Orion had become a central part of her daily existence. There was something almost ritualistic in the way she performed each task, as if these moments with her beloved horse represented the only truly authentic part of her current life. Her face, when caught in profile by the stable's subtle lighting, showed traces of the child Helena remembered, but had been transformed by experiences that remained mysterious and potentially traumatic. The stallion's response to his young caretaker was equally telling, his obvious contentment in her presence speaking to a relationship that had endured whatever circumstances had brought them to this place. Orion had aged well, his coat still lustrous and his bearing still proud, but there was something in his eyes that suggested awareness of their unusual situation. He was a prisoner, however gilded his cage, kept for purposes that had nothing to do with his own welfare and everything to do with his captor's twisted desires. The full horror of the situation began to crystallize in Helena's mind as she watched this touching scene of reunion between horse and rider. Warren Hayes had not only kidnapped her daughter, but had created an elaborate prison disguised as luxury, keeping Chloe isolated from the world while allowing her to maintain her connection to the horse that had been the center of her young life. It was psychological manipulation of the most sophisticated kind, providing enough comfort and familiar elements to prevent complete despair, while maintaining absolute control over every aspect of her existence. Helena's hands trembled with suppressed emotion as she struggled to maintain her silent observation, every maternal instinct demanding immediate action, while her rational mind insisted on careful planning. The young woman before her was alive, apparently healthy, but clearly living under circumstances that were far from normal. The challenge now was to find a way to rescue both daughter and horse without triggering whatever security measures Warren Hayes had undoubtedly put in place to prevent exactly this scenario. The moment of recognition between mother and daughter hung in the air like a crystal bubble, perfect and fragile, waiting to either burst into joy or shatter into 1,000 pieces of renewed anguish. Helena's entire body trembled with the effort of remaining silent, every maternal instinct screaming at her to rush forward and embrace the child she had mourned for 6 years. Chloe's face, illuminated by the soft, stable lighting, showed the confusion of someone trying to process an impossibility, her features cycling through emotions too complex for immediate comprehension. The young woman who had been 15 when she vanished now possessed the refined beauty of adulthood, her face having lost the soft roundness of adolescence and gained the defined cheekbones and mature expression that marked her transition to womanhood. But her eyes remained unchanged, those distinctive green irises that Helena had passed down through genetics and recognized with the absolute certainty that only a mother could possess. Those were her daughter's eyes, older and perhaps wiser, but unmistakably the same windows to a soul that Helena had thought lost forever. Orion shifted restlessly in his luxurious stall, his equine senses detecting the emotional charge that filled the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The stallion's ears swiveled constantly between the two women, his intelligent mind processing the significance of this encounter, even if he could not understand its full implications. His nostrils flared as he caught Helena's scent, some deep memory perhaps stirring within his equine consciousness as he recognized the woman who had once been such an important part of his world. The stable around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of horses settling for the night muted by the weight of the moment. Dust motes danced in the beams of carefully positioned lighting, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that made the scene feel dreamlike and surreal. Helena's heart hammered against her ribs with such force that she was certain everyone present could hear it, the sound seeming to echo off the polished surfaces of this monument to wealth and obsession. Liam stood frozen near the stable entrance, his young face pale with the realization that he was witnessing something far more significant than a simple break-in or theft. His hands hung at his sides, trembling slightly with the nervous energy of someone who understood that they were balanced on the edge of a precipice that could send them all tumbling into an abyss of consequences. The young man's eyes darted between Helena and Chloe, his mind clearly racing as he attempted to process the implications of what he was observing. The sound of footsteps on the concrete aisle outside shattered the moment like a gunshot in a cathedral. Helena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the measured cadence of expensive shoes approaching their location, each footfall carrying the confidence of someone who owned everything within these walls and beyond. The rhythmic clicking grew louder with each passing second, accompanied by the soft whisper of fabric against fabric that suggested formal clothing moving with purpose through the stable complex. Warren Hayes appeared in the doorway like a specter materializing from shadow, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from one of tentative hope to palpable menace. He was impeccably dressed, despite the late hour, his silk shirt and tailored slacks suggesting someone who maintained appearances even in private moments. His silver hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, and his face bore the expression of mild amusement that might grace the features of someone who had just discovered an interesting but ultimately harmless diversion. But it was his eyes that revealed the true nature of the man beneath the polished exterior. They held a coldness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the flat, calculating gaze of a predator who had cornered his prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. There was no surprise in his expression, no shock at finding intruders in his private sanctuary. Instead, he radiated the calm confidence of someone who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it accordingly. The silence that followed his arrival was deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls and the barely audible hum of the facility's ventilation system. Helena felt exposed under Warren's scrutiny, like a specimen pinned to a board for examination. Every instinct told her to flee, to grab Chloe and run. But rational thought reminded her that they were trapped in his fortress with nowhere to go and no way to escape whatever he had planned for them. Warren's smile began as a subtle upturn at the corners of his mouth, gradually spreading across his features like oil spreading across water. It was the expression devoid of warmth or genuine humor, the kind of smile that predators wore when playing with their prey. His hands remained clasped behind his back in a pose that suggested casual conversation, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the coiled energy of someone prepared for violence if necessary. The man's gaze moved methodically from person to person, cataloging their positions and reactions with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to controlling every variable in any given situation. When his eyes settled on Helena, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. There was recognition there, but also something darker, a satisfaction that suggested he had been expecting this confrontation for some time and had made his preparations accordingly. Chloe's reaction to Warren's appearance was immediate and telling. Her entire posture changed, shoulders drawing inward as if to make herself smaller, her head dropping slightly in a gesture of submission that had clearly been learned through years of conditioning. The confident young woman who had been tending to Orion with such natural grace suddenly seemed younger, more vulnerable, transformed by Warren's presence into something approaching a frightened child, seeking to avoid punishment. The psychological dynamics at play became clear to Helena as she observed this transformation. Warren's control over Chloe was not maintained through physical restraints, but through more subtle forms of manipulation that had shaped her behavior over the course of 6 years. The luxurious prison he had created was designed not just to contain her body, but to control her mind, to make her dependent on his approval and fearful of his displeasure. Warren's first words emerged from his throat like honey laced with poison, the cultured tones of his voice at odds with the predatory gleam in his eyes. He spoke with the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather, as if the presence of intruders in his most private sanctuary was merely an interesting development rather than a serious security breach. His hands remained clasped behind his back, but Helena could see the slight tension in his frame that suggested he was prepared for rapid movement if the situation required it. The confession that followed was delivered with the same casual tone, as if Warren were discussing a successful business transaction, rather than revealing the details of a kidnapping that had destroyed multiple lives. He spoke of first seeing Chloe at a regional competition 3 years before her disappearance, his attention captured not just by her obvious talent, but by the rare combination of skill, dedication, and natural ability that marked her as exceptional even among elite young riders. His obsession had begun that day, he revealed with disturbing frankness, growing from initial interest to consuming fascination as he researched her background and followed her competitive career. He had studied her techniques, analyzed her performances, and gradually convinced himself that her potential was being wasted in the modest circumstances of Wildwood stables. In his twisted worldview, he was not a kidnapper, but a benefactor, rescuing exceptional talent from mediocrity and providing it with the resources necessary to achieve true greatness. The planning phase of his crime had taken 2 years. Warren continued with obvious pride in his thoroughness and attention to detail. He had used his considerable resources to map every aspect of Chloe's routine, identifying the perfect opportunity to intercept her during one of her regular trail rides through the Virginia wilderness. His wealth had purchased silence from those few individuals who might have asked uncomfortable questions, while his reputation and social connections provided cover for any activities that might have seemed suspicious to outside observers. The actual abduction had been carried out with military precision, he boasted. His team of carefully selected professionals executing a plan that left no traces and no witnesses. Chloe and Orion had simply vanished from the trail, as if they had never existed, transported to this carefully prepared sanctuary where they could be kept safe from the inferior world that had previously constrained their potential. The search efforts that had consumed months of Helena's life had been deliberately misdirected through false leads and planted evidence that reinforced the official theory of accidental death in the wilderness. Warren's justification for his actions revealed the depth of his delusion and narcissism. In his mind, he had not destroyed a family or traumatized a child, but had instead provided Chloe with opportunities that her previous life could never have offered. The years of captivity he described as an intensive training program, designed to transform her from a merely talented amateur into a truly world-class equestrian. The isolation and psychological manipulation were reframed as necessary elements of focus and dedication required to achieve excellence. The conditions of Chloe's captivity had been carefully designed to break down her resistance while providing enough comfort to prevent complete despair. She had been given Orion as both companion and incentive, allowed to maintain the relationship that meant most to her while being gradually conditioned to accept her new reality. Warren had positioned himself as both captor and benefactor, the source of both punishment and reward. creating a psychological dependency that had taken years to establish and perfect. Helena's horror grew with each revelation, her mind struggling to process the casual way Warren described years of psychological torture disguised as beneficence. The man speaking was not the philanthropic technology mogul known to the public, but a predator who had used his resources and intelligence to create an elaborate fantasy in which his victim was supposed to be grateful for her captivity. His complete lack of empathy or understanding of the pain he had caused was perhaps more disturbing than his original crime. The realization that Warren was armed became apparent when he shifted his stance slightly, revealing the outline of a weapon concealed beneath his expensive jacket. The gesture was subtle but deliberate, a reminder that he held all the advantages in this confrontation and was prepared to use them if necessary. His calm demeanor never wavered, but the implicit threat was clear. This sanctuary was his domain, and those who violated it did so at their own peril. Liam's position near the stable entrance suddenly took on new significance, as Warren's gaze settled on the young man with particular intensity. The boy's face had gone pale as he realized the full implications of what he had witnessed, his earlier willingness to help transform into terror as he understood the kind of man he had been working for. The knowledge he now possessed made him a liability that Warren could not afford to ignore, and the predatory calculation in the older man's eyes made his intentions clear. The atmosphere in the stable had become charged with imminent violence, the careful politeness of Warren's manner barely containing the ruthless pragmatism that had allowed him to maintain his secret for 6 years. Helena could sense that they had reached a turning point where words would give way to action, where the comfortable facade of civilized behavior would be stripped away to reveal the savage reality beneath. The next few moments would determine whether this reunion would end in salvation or tragedy, and the odds seemed overwhelmingly stacked against them. The tension in the stable had reached a breaking point when the soft whisper of fabric against fabric announced another arrival. The sound was barely audible above the nervous shuffling of horses in their stalls, but in the electrically charged atmosphere it seemed to echo like thunder through the luxurious space. Warren's head turned slightly, his predatory smile faltering for the first time as he registered this unexpected development in what he had assumed was a completely controlled situation. Penelope Hayes emerged from the shadows of the stable entrance like a phantom given substance, her elegant figure moving with a purpose that transformed her entire being. The fragile, melancholic woman Helena had encountered at the competition had vanished, replaced by someone whose spine was rigid with determination, and whose eyes burned with the fierce light of long-suppressed rage. Her designer clothing, still immaculate despite the late hour, seemed like armor that had been donned for battle rather than mere fashion. The weapon in Penelope's hands gleamed dully under the stable's sophisticated lighting system, its metal surface reflecting fragments of the scene like a broken mirror of reality. The pistol looked incongruous in her manicured grip, yet she held it with a steadiness that suggested familiarity with its weight and purpose. Her breathing was controlled and measured, the respiration of someone who had made a momentous decision and was prepared to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited. Warren's reaction to his wife's appearance was immediate and telling. The confident mask he had worn throughout his confession cracked like ice under sudden pressure, revealing beneath it a flash of genuine surprise that quickly transformed into calculating assessment. His hands, which had remained casually clasped behind his back, moved slowly toward his concealed weapon as he recalibrated the dynamics of the confrontation. The predator had suddenly found himself facing another predator, one whose motivations and capabilities he had clearly underestimated. The transformation in Penelope's demeanor was complete and startling. Years of suppressed emotion had crystallized into this moment of terrible clarity, burning away the carefully constructed facade of the dutiful society wife to reveal something far more dangerous beneath. Her face, usually soft with melancholy, had hardened into planes of determination that spoke of decisions made in the deepest hours of night when conscience finally overwhelmed self-preservation. Helena found herself caught between terror and amazement as she watched this unexpected ally emerge from the shadows of her captivity. The woman who had passed her Chloe's medallion with trembling fingers now stood with the rock-steady composure of someone who had finally found the courage to act on convictions that had been building for years. The metamorphosis was so complete that Helena wondered how long Penelope had been planning this moment, how many nights she had lain awake rehearsing this confrontation in her mind. The silence that followed Penelope's appearance stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, broken only by the gentle sounds of horses moving restlessly in their stalls. Orion's dark eyes reflected the tension that filled the air, his equine senses detecting the human emotions that crackled around him like electricity. Chloe remained frozen near the stallion's stall, her face a mask of confusion and fear as she tried to process this latest development in a night that had already shattered her carefully controlled world. Liam pressed himself against the stable wall, his young face pale with the realization that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple family dispute. His eyes darted between the three adults, calculating distances and escape routes with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that his survival might depend on reading the situation correctly. The weapon in Penelope's hand had transformed what might have been a confrontation of words into something with potentially lethal consequences. Warren's voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of its previous smooth confidence. The cultured tones that had delivered his horrific confession with such casual arrogance now held an edge of uncertainty that suggested he was facing a variable he had not anticipated in his careful planning. His posture remained outwardly calm, but Helena could see the subtle tension in his shoulders that indicated readiness for sudden movement. The accusations that poured from Penelope's lips came with the force of water bursting through a dam that had held back years of accumulated pressure. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through Warren's carefully constructed public persona to expose the monster that lurked beneath. She spoke of years of suspicion, of evidence carefully gathered and hidden away, of nights spent listening to him make phone calls that painted a picture of activities far removed from his philanthropic public image. Her revelations painted a portrait of a marriage that had been a prison almost from its beginning, with Warren using his wealth and influence to control every aspect of her existence, just as he had controlled Chloe's. The psychological manipulation that had kept his young victim compliant had been perfected through years of practice on his own wife, creating a master class in subtle coercion that had left Penelope trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. The moment when Warren reached for his concealed weapon seemed to unfold in slow motion, his hand moving toward his jacket with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for this eventuality. But Penelope's response was faster, her finger tightening on the trigger with the decisive action of someone who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The stable lighting caught the flash of determination in her eyes as she made the choice that would define the remainder of her life. The gunshot, when it came, was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, the sound reverberating off the polished surfaces of the luxury stable like thunder trapped in a cathedral. The horses in their stalls reacted with immediate alarm, their whinnies and stamping hooves adding to the chaos as the smell of gunpowder filled the carefully climate-controlled air. Warren's body jerked backward from the impact, his carefully styled appearance suddenly disheveled as he staggered against the expensive woodwork of a stall front. The sight of blood spreading across Warren's silk shirt created a surreal tableau against the backdrop of his meticulously maintained equestrian palace. His face registered shock and disbelief, as if he could not quite accept that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The weapon he had been reaching for fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against the rubber flooring with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the aftermath of the gunshot. But Warren's final act was one of spite and cruelty that transcended his own mortality. Even as his strength ebbed away, he managed to retrieve his fallen weapon with desperate fingers, his dying brain focused on ensuring that his betrayer would not survive to enjoy her victory. The second gunshot followed closely after the first, its report seeming even louder as it echoed through the stable complex and out into the night air beyond. Penelope's body crumpled with heartbreaking grace, her elegant form folding in on itself as the bullet found its mark. The weapon fell from her hand as she collapsed, her sacrifice complete even as her life's blood began to pool on the pristine stable floor. Her face, even in death, held an expression of profound relief, as if the burden she had carried for so many years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Warren's own collapse followed moments later, his body giving up its fight against the damage Penelope's bullet had inflicted. The man who had wielded such power and influence over the lives of others was reduced in his final moments to something pitiful and broken, his carefully maintained facade stripped away to reveal the hollow core beneath. His last breath rattled through the stable air like a death prayer for the evil he had perpetrated. The sudden silence that followed the violence was almost more shocking than the gunshots themselves. Helena's ears rang with the after effects of the weapon's discharge, while her mind struggled to process the rapid sequence of events that had transformed the confrontation from tense standoff to deadly resolution. The metallic smell of blood mingled with the familiar stable odors of hay and leather, creating a sensory cocktail that would be burned into her memory forever. Chloe's reaction to the violence was immediate and visceral, her body shaking with shock as she witnessed the destruction of the only world she had known for 6 years. The young woman who had been conditioned to accept Warren as both captor and benefactor now faced the reality of his death and the implications it held for her future. Her face cycled through expressions of horror, confusion, and something that might have been relief as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Liam was the first to recover his composure, his survival instincts overriding his shock as he realized that the sound of gunshots would inevitably attract attention from security personnel stationed elsewhere on the estate. His voice, when he managed to speak, carried the urgency of someone who understood that their window of opportunity for escape was measured in minutes rather than hours. The luxury that surrounded them had suddenly transformed from prison to trap, beautiful but deadly to anyone caught within its confines. The escape that followed was a masterclass in desperate efficiency, with each second potentially being their last moment of freedom. Helena moved toward Chloe with the single-minded determination of a mother reclaiming her stolen child, while Liam took point in navigating them through the complex layout of the estate's grounds. The young man's intimate knowledge of the property became their lifeline, his familiarity with service roads and maintenance paths providing alternatives to the main routes that would certainly be monitored by security systems. Orion's presence complicated their escape, but Helena refused to leave behind the horse who had shared her daughter's captivity. The stallion seemed to sense the urgency of the situation, his training and intelligence making him a cooperative participant in their flight from the scene of violence. His hooves made sharp clicking sounds against the concrete as they led him from his luxurious stall toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The journey to Liam's pickup truck felt like an eternity compressed into minutes, each step carrying them further from the nightmare they were leaving behind and closer to the possibility of genuine freedom. The vehicle sat in the employee parking area like a beacon of salvation, its humble appearance a stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded Warren's estate, but representing something far more valuable. A means of escape from the elaborate prison that had held Chloe for 6 years. The engine turning over seemed impossibly loud in the night air, but it also represented the sound of hope given mechanical form. As they drove away from the estate, Helena felt the first stirrings of something she had not experienced since that October morning when her world had shattered. The possibility that tomorrow might bring joy instead of sorrow, reunion instead of separation, healing instead of endless grief. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in 6 years, it led toward light instead of darkness. The dashboard clock glowed 3:47 a.m. as Liam's pickup truck rumbled through the Virginia countryside, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like fingers of hope reaching toward salvation. Helena sat in the passenger seat with her cell phone pressed to her ear, her voice shaking as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher who had initially struggled to believe the extraordinary story unfolding through the crackling connection. Behind them, Chloe huddled in the corner of the truck bed, wrapped in an old horse blanket that Liam had kept for emergencies, her arms wrapped protectively around herself as she processed the reality of freedom after 6 years of captivity. The weight of the night's events pressed down on all of them like a physical burden, the adrenaline that had carried them through their escape now giving way to the crushing realization of what they had experienced and survived. Helena's hands trembled as she attempted to provide coherent details to the authorities, her maternal instincts warring with the need to ensure that proper procedures were followed to guarantee Chloe's safety, and Warren's crimes were properly documented for prosecution. The first police cars appeared on the horizon like distant stars, their emergency lights painting the darkness in alternating patterns of red and blue that reflected off the truck's mirrors and windows. Helena felt a complex mixture of relief and terror as these symbols of official authority approached, knowing that their arrival would mark the beginning of a process that would expose her daughter's ordeal to public scrutiny, while hopefully ensuring that justice was served for the crimes that had shattered their lives. The scene at the roadside rendezvous was controlled chaos, with multiple law enforcement agencies converging on what would quickly become one of the most significant criminal cases in Virginia's recent history. FBI agents arrived within hours, their black vehicles forming a protective perimeter around the small group of survivors, while evidence teams prepared to descend upon Warren Hayes' estate. Helena watched these preparations with the detached fascination of someone observing a movie about their own life, unable to fully process that the nightmare was finally ending. Chloe's reunion with the outside world was heartbreaking in its tentative nature. The confident 15-year-old who had vanished into the Virginia woods had been replaced by a young woman whose movements carried the careful wariness of someone who had learned to expect danger from unexpected sources. She flinched at sudden movements and loud noises, her green eyes constantly scanning for threats that might materialize from the darkness that had protected her captor for so long. The medical examinations that followed were necessary but traumatic, conducted in sterile hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and carried the institutional coldness that marked all such facilities. Helena held her daughter's hand throughout the procedures, feeling the trembling in Chloe's fingers as strangers in white coats documented the physical evidence of her ordeal. The young woman's body showed signs of good care, but also the subtle marks of prolonged psychological stress, muscle tension that spoke of constant vigilance, weight loss that suggested chronic anxiety, and a pallor that indicated years spent indoors away from natural sunlight. The psychological evaluations revealed the sophisticated nature of Warren's manipulation and control. Chloe had been subjected to a carefully orchestrated program of isolation and conditioning, designed to break down her resistance while maintaining her value as both trophy and possession. The psychiatrists who interviewed her spoke in hushed tones about Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding, using clinical terms to describe the complex psychological prison that had been constructed around her mind as surely as the physical barriers that had contained her body. The investigation into Warren Hayes' activities expanded rapidly as authorities discovered evidence of a criminal enterprise far more extensive than a single kidnapping. Financial records revealed a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that had been used to fund his illegal activities, while computer files contained detailed profiles of dozens of other potential victims who had been studied and stalked but never taken. The scope of his obsession was breathtaking in its breadth and terrifying in its implications. The media response was swift and merciless, transforming Warren Hayes from philanthropic icon to reviled monster in the span of 24 hours. News vans lined the roads leading to his estate, while helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing aerial footage of the crime scene that would be broadcast around the world. The same reporters who had once praised his charitable contributions now dissected every aspect of his public persona, searching for signs of the predator that had hidden beneath his carefully constructed facade. Helena found herself thrust into the spotlight as the grieving mother whose determination had finally brought her daughter home. Interview requests poured in from networks around the globe, all wanting to hear the story of the woman who had never given up hope despite 6 years of official indifference and public assumption that her child was dead. She struggled with the attention, her natural inclination toward privacy warring with her understanding that publicity might help other families in similar situations. The trial preparations consumed months of their lives, with prosecutors building a case that would have sent Warren Hayes to prison for multiple life sentences if he had survived Penelope's desperate intervention. Liam's testimony proved crucial in establishing the systematic nature of Warren's crimes, his insider knowledge providing details about the estate's security systems and the procedures used to maintain Chloe's captivity. The young man's courage in coming forward despite obvious risks to his own safety earned him recognition as a hero whose actions had made the rescue possible. The revelation of other victims scattered across multiple states painted a picture of a predator whose activities had been far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Young equestrians who had been reported missing over the previous decade were now being investigated as potential victims of Warren's network, their disappearances reviewed with new understanding of his methods and motivations. The scope of the investigation grew to encompass federal agencies and international law enforcement as the full extent of his crimes became apparent. Wildwood Stables, which had been on the verge of foreclosure when Helena embarked on her desperate journey to Virginia, suddenly found itself the beneficiary of overwhelming public support. Donations poured in from around the world as people were moved by the story of the mother who had never stopped searching for her missing child. A prominent technology executive, moved by Helena's story and disgusted by Warren's corruption of his industry, stepped forward with a sponsorship deal that would secure the ranch's future, while providing resources for its expansion into a therapeutic riding program for trauma survivors. The return to Virginia soil was deeply emotional for both mother and daughter, the familiar landscape carrying memories both beautiful and terrible that would need to be processed and integrated into their healing journey. Helena drove slowly through the gates of her family ranch, noting how the property had been maintained by neighbors and volunteers during her absence, their care ensuring that Wildwood Stables remained ready for her return. Orion's reintegration into his original home was both triumphant and bittersweet, the magnificent stallion seeming to remember every detail of the place where he had spent his early years. His reunion with the other horses was marked by whickering calls and gentle investigation as the herd re-established their social bonds. But it was his relationship with Chloe that commanded the most attention, their connection serving as both anchor and healing balm for psychological wounds that would take years to fully address. The first night back at Wildwood Stables was filled with sounds and sensations that had once been commonplace, but now seemed almost magical in their familiarity. Helena stood at her kitchen window, the same spot where she had watched dawn break on the morning she had prepared for the Virginia competition that changed everything. But now Chloe stood beside her, both women wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill as they watched Orion graze peacefully in the moonlit pasture. The healing process was neither linear nor predictable, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs that came without warning or apparent pattern. Some days brought genuine laughter and moments of pure joy as mother and daughter rediscovered their relationship. Other days were consumed by tears and silence as they grappled with trauma that had no easy resolution. Professional counselors became regular visitors to the ranch, their expertise helping navigate the complex psychological landscape left behind by Warren's crimes. Chloe's return to riding was gradual and carefully managed, each session building upon small victories, while respecting the psychological barriers that 6 years of captivity had created. Her natural talent remained intact, but it was now tempered by wariness and the need to rebuild trust not just with horses, but with her own instincts and abilities. Helena watched these sessions with a mixture of pride and protective concern, marveling at her daughter's resilience while remaining alert for signs of distress that might require intervention. The transformation of Wildwood Stables into a therapeutic facility brought new purpose to their lives, providing a way to channel their trauma into something that could help others facing similar challenges. Young riders who had experienced various forms of trauma found their way to the ranch, where they could work with horses in an environment that understood the complex relationship between healing and trust. Chloe gradually began working with these new students, her own experience providing unique insight into the power of equine therapy. The media attention gradually faded as other stories captured public interest, but the impact of their ordeal continued to ripple outward in ways both seen and unseen. Other families with missing children reached out for support and advice, while law enforcement agencies implemented new protocols based on lessons learned from Warren's case. The tragedy that had nearly destroyed their family had been transformed into a force for positive change that would continue long after the news cameras moved on to other stories. The first anniversary of Chloe's return was marked by a quiet celebration at the ranch, attended only by family friends and the volunteers who had helped maintain Wildwood Stables during Helena's absence. As the sun set over the Virginia countryside, mother and daughter stood together in the pasture where Orion grazed contentedly, their hands intertwined as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The scars remained, would always remain, but they had begun to fade from angry red wounds to silver lines that marked survival rather than victimization. Helena had learned that healing was not about forgetting or returning to some previous state of innocence, but about integrating trauma into a larger story of resilience and hope. Chloe was not the same girl who had vanished into the woods 6 years earlier, but she was something perhaps more valuable. A survivor who had found her way back to love and light despite the darkness that had tried to claim her. The future stretched ahead of them like an unmarked trail through familiar countryside, full of possibilities that they would explore together. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and periods of struggle, but they would face them as they had faced everything else, together, with the strength that came from love that had survived the worst that evil could devise. The promise of tomorrow glowed on the horizon like dawn after the longest night, and they walked toward it with confidence, born of tested love and proven resilience. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.